Hello and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching video number 6, Managing and Administering Virtual Server. This is part of Fast Track CBT Video Lab on Microsoft Virtualization. In this video, we'll talk about virtual server security. We'll learn about the VMRC configuration and how to get VMRC traffic through your firewall. We'll learn about the importance of virtual server paths, virtual server website properties, resource allocation, and some basics about performance monitoring. We'll learn more about the importance of events, and then in our scenario, we'll bring all that we've learned in these first 6 videos together by building our own virtual network with 3 different virtual servers. With that, let's get started. So first, let's talk about virtual server security. With virtual server security, you need to remember that when you bring on your new virtual machine, it typically is bridged to your own network. It could be on its own network, but many people bridge it to their own network, and that way they can download patches and updates from the internet. Now, when it's bridged to your own network, remember that it requires security just like all other workstations and servers on your network. This includes firewalls, operating system patches, application patches, antivirus software, up-to-date virus definitions, and anti-spyware applications. So just because it's a virtual server and you might think, oh, it's just a test machine, keep in mind you still have to keep all these things up to date on it. That's because, it could be attacked from the internet or even from your own intranet and taken over to, do something horrible like spread a virus. So it's a computer that's on the network typically, and it has to be secured. Now, if it's off the network and you make sure that you always keep it off the network on its own virtual private network, then you typically don't have to worry about security. But as long as it's on your production network or even your home network for that matter, you have to keep it up to date just like any other computer. As soon as you start surfing the internet with a virtual server, it's bound to get some sort of virus if it doesn't have some sort of antivirus software. Now, if there's more than just you administering your virtual servers, you should use the principle of least privilege. Now, the principle of least privilege just says don't give anyone any more access than what they need to do their job. So if you have, say, an accountant who just needs to start up the accounting virtual server, well, then that accountant doesn't need any more access than what they need to start the accounting virtual server. They don't need full administrator access. They don't need local administrator access, whatever it is. All they need is the access to start that server and do their job. So basically, that's what the principle of least privilege says. Now, each virtual machine should be contained in its own folder, and that folder can be secured with NTFS file and folder permissions. Now, Virtual Server recognizes Windows users and groups, and they can be used to configure security within the Virtual Server web-based administrative interface. And I'm going to come back to this one we just talked about, which is the NTFS file and folder permissions, because you don't want to just run out there and start changing file and folder permissions inside the Microsoft Virtual Server folders. But so I'm going to come back to that. Now, Virtual Server really is just changing the NTFS permissions on the shared virtual machine folder when you configure Virtual Server security in the Virtual Server web-based administrative interface. So it's really just changing NTFS permissions. But they're not always, the most basic permissions. They're not always just read, write, and execute. They might have special read permissions, special write permissions, all sorts of special things. So you have to be very careful when you go in and you change the permissions yourself using NTFS security. Really, the best way to do it is through the web-based interface. Now, note that if you apply NTFS security through the web-based administrative interface, it takes effect immediately. That's in contrast to you going out there and changing the NTFS permissions yourself. You're going to have to shut down those virtual machines. You might have to shut down a virtual server and restart it to see the differences take effect. So that's just another benefit to using the web-based administrative interface. All right, now by default, only the local administrators group has full access to your virtual server's administrative interfaces, assuming you've installed this on just a local workgroup computer. Now, the permissions shown in the Microsoft Virtual Server web-based administrative interface apply to this entire virtual server. To apply permissions to individual virtual machines, you must use NTFS folder file permissions. So that's where the NTFS folder and file permissions come in, is if you intend to secure just an individual virtual machine. But you have to use a lot of caution in doing that, because those permissions can be very complicated and you can mess up something very easily. So before we talk a little bit more about the NTFS folder file permissions, let's come back to the web-based administrative interface. And by the way, I'm going to show you this interface in just a minute. But first, let's talk about the permissions that you might be modifying in that web-based administrative interface. If I can get just enough of this on the screen here. All right, now to understand the permissions that you're modifying inside the virtual server web-based administrative interface, I copied over this chart that's located in the Virtual Server Administrator's Guide. The Virtual Server Administrator's Guide, by the way, is an electronic help documentation that's included in Microsoft Virtual Server 2005. If you go down here to Start, go to Programs, Microsoft Virtual Server, then over here to the Virtual Server Administrative Guide. It's a very powerful document that has just tons of information. So that's where I obtained the copy of this information here that's tabbed over. Now what this tells me is when I select the different permissions to secure my virtual machine or virtual server, it tells me what those permissions really mean. So when it just says full, full exactly to what? It says that full selects the checkbox for these permissions to automatically select all other permissions. So when you select full, it just selects everything else. Then there's modify. If you select modify, that gives you the ability to add virtual machines and virtual networks to the virtual server and make changes to the following pages: the VMRC, the server properties, virtual server script settings, virtual server search paths. If I go on down, the next one is view. If I select view, let's see here. This allows you to view configuration information for virtual machines for which the user has read permissions. So you have to have read permissions, and then you can view configuration information. Then we have remove, just allows you to remove virtual machines. Change allows you to change permissions on the virtual server security properties page. There's control. This is access to the COM interfaces. This allows the user to manage virtual server by using the COM interfaces or the administrative website. This permission is required for a user account or group to have any administrative control over a virtual server. Without it, the administrative website and COM interfaces are not available. If the user account or group has been granted permissions on the virtual machine configuration file, VMC file, but denied this permission, the user account or group can manage the virtual machine by using the VMRC client, but not by using the administrative website. So you can see where this starts to get a little bit complicated if you start going through here and selecting individual users to have individual permissions. Then, of course, there's special permissions. And I'm going to be showing you the security settings on the virtual server here in just a second, so I want you to keep those settings up there in mind. Before we do that, let's talk about scripts. Just briefly, we're going to have a whole video on scripts, but just briefly on scripts, Microsoft virtual machines, the machines themselves, the guest operating systems, can run scripts if it's enabled. Now these scripts would happen on the host operating system. So here you have a virtual machine running a script on the host operating system through the virtual server administrative interface. Now these scripts that are run under the user account that started the virtual machine. So for this reason, you may want to modify the user account that the virtual machines run under. And I'll show you how to do that. But that's an important security feature that you might want to take into account if you start assigning different users to run virtual machines and start virtual machines themselves. Keep in mind that they could also potentially run scripts on the host computer. Now for your account to work, this custom account you make, say that's going to have the ability to start and stop a virtual machine, it must have a number of permissions. It must have read and execute and write on the VMC. It has to have read-write on the VHD, read and execute on the VNC, and some special read attributes and read extended attributes are required. If you really want to set up this user account and set these permissions on the virtual machines, files, and folders, you can refer to the administrator's guide and you'll find more information on the specific read attributes and extended attributes that you'll have to configure. Now, I do recommend that you join each virtual server to the domain if you're in a domain environment. This provides access to domain security users and groups, and you can use those domain security users and groups to configure security on the virtual machine. So you could create a group, an Active Directory group, say that has permission to start virtual machines, and then you could assign all those users to start up virtual machines. By using Active Directory's security, it also increases security for a virtual server because Active Directory has increased security for logging and policy options. Now, if you choose to have the virtual server access files, say like ISO files or VHD files, across the network, you'll have to use something called constrained delegation. And you can read more about configuring constrained delegation in the Virtual Server Administrator's Guide. And again, it's right down here in Start, Programs, Microsoft Virtual Server, and Virtual Server Administrator's Guide. This is what it looks like. You can go into the contents here and expand it. There's all sorts of how-to, articles, how to set up virtual server, how to configure it, set up virtual disks, all sorts of great things in here. So I'll close that out. Now let's see how this security actually works in the web interface. So here in the web interface, to configure security, you scroll down here and go to Server Properties. And inside Server Properties, there's the Virtual Server Security. Now, by default, just one entry is defined, and that is for the administrators group. That's a group, the local administrators group, to allow the following permissions, which is all full permissions. So that's the only entry by default, and here you can check to remove entries. Of course, you can't remove this one because that's the administrator account. So to add an entry, I click here, Add Entry. If I scroll down, I can add a user or group that could have special permissions. So you have to actually type in the user or group here. So it would have to be like D Davis. Or if it was a domain account, it could be like ddavis@bluecrabfood.com. So you can do it like that, or if you just type in a username, it considers it a local account. You can set up permissions to allow or deny. Full checks all checkboxes. If you uncheck full, then you can configure just individual checkboxes here. So let's just allow D Davis to modify, view, and remove virtual servers. All right, now it says 2 entries are defined. And when I'm allowing this user here, D Davis, to modify, view, or remove virtual servers, I'm talking about all virtual servers on this host operating system. So at this level in here, I cannot control, say, D Davis to just be able to modify, view, and remove a certain virtual server. The web interface doesn't allow that. To do that, you have to go to the actual folders and files and configure that using NTFS security, which can be, kind of hairy. So let me show you how to do that. Let's go ahead and let's remove this entry here. And let's minimize this. Let's go and take a look at the NTFS security on those folders and files. So for example, here's a virtual server. If we go into sharing and security, and I click on the security tab here, here's the NTFS permissions. So you can see that administrators has allow access for everything. D. Davis on client 1 only has special permissions. No other permissions are allowed there. To find out the special permissions, you have to go in here to advanced and see exactly what D. Davis has. D. Davis has full control for this folder only. And here you can go to effective permissions. You can type in a user or group. Well, actually, you have to select it. I'm sorry. You have to select a user or group. Then you can see exactly what permissions that user or group has. So if you drill down a little bit farther and you do permissions on the VHD, here are similar entries. And again, you can go into advanced and you can see effective permissions. And D. Davis has the permissions on these files that he has, not because of the settings I configured over here a second ago, but instead because that's actually the user that installed Microsoft Virtual Server. That's me, of course, and I'm a member of the local administrators group. So I do have full permissions on the machine, but because I installed the application, that's how it configured these settings or security settings on the folders and files. So again, the only way to configure access to start or stop or change just a particular virtual machine is to use NTFS permissions. You do have to stop and restart the virtual machine, and it can be a little bit iffy. The best way is to configure virtual server security for the entire virtual server using the web-based administrative interface. Now, it actually really does just change the NTFS permissions, but it does it properly, of course. And you don't have to start and stop any virtual machines for those changes to take effect. Again, I recommend you join each virtual server to the domain. That'll give you access to domain users and groups, as well as some additional security, settings. If you have to access files like ISO files or VHD files over the network, that means actually have the virtual server say mount an ISO file over the network. You have to do this thing called constrained delegation. Keep that in mind. You can't just expect your virtual server to be able to access a network path and mount an ISO file across the network. So that's virtual server security. And now let's move on and talk about the VMRC. Now, the VMRC is the virtual machine remote client. Let's start up the virtual machine remote client just so you can see what I'm talking about. If I go to Microsoft Virtual Server, VMRCC, the virtual machine remote control client, I guess is the proper Microsoft name. If you open that right there, it brings up this little client that allows you to connect using this sort of URL convention to your virtual machine. So if I click connect there, actually it's turning on WinServer 2 because I connected to it. And it'll start it up automatically because I told it I wanted to connect to that virtual server. So let's minimize that. I just wanted to show you what the VMRC is before we start talking about how to configure it. So by default, the VMRC does not encrypt data. Any data you send using the VMRC is not encrypted as it goes across the network. But the VMRC security can be enhanced by enabling Kerberos authentication and SSL encryption. Let's take a look and see how this works. So if I go to the web-based administrative interface, inside the server properties right down here, you see here the virtual machine remote control server. So this is the server that's accepting those connections from the virtual machine remote client. So of course we're running both of these on the same computer. The server and the client are running on the same computer. Typically, that's not how it's done. Typically, you'd run the VMRC, from some client computer, say your desktop computer, and you're using it to connect to the virtual server running on your virtual server, say over in the data center. Um, but in our case, they're on the same client. Either way, it doesn't make that much of difference. If you go in here, though, you can configure the VMRC server, and that's what we want to do. So here we can enable or disable the VMRC server if we want to get rid of it altogether. If you had multiple NICs, you could assign the VMRC just to respond on a single NIC. You can change the TCP/IP port. By default, it uses port 5900, which is important if you're trying to get this traffic through your firewall, which we'll talk about in a minute. You can set here by default the screen resolution that you want the screen to come up at when you connect using the VMRC. The next thing you can do here is configure authentication. Now, we said earlier that Kerberos is the strongest form of authentication. However, you cannot configure Kerberos authentication unless your virtual server is a member of your Active Directory domain. That's because Kerberos is going to authenticate to the Active Directory to authenticate whoever's connecting. So you cannot use Kerberos unless you have your virtual server as a member of an Active Directory domain. So what we have to do is leave it at automatic because right now we're in a workstation. The next thing you can look at is disconnecting on idle. So here it says disconnect idle sessions if they're timed out for longer than 15 minutes. You can uncheck that if you never want to disconnect idle sessions, or you could increase it potentially if you wanted to wait longer. The next thing here is SSL slash TLS 1.0 encryption. So here I can choose to encrypt my connection, my VMRC connection, as it goes across the network. To configure that, you have to fill out, certificate information here, which we're not going to do. We don't have a certificate server on our network. But that is something you can do to help better secure your VMRC if you had a certificate server. So because we don't have a certificate server, I'm going to uncheck that, and we'll apply our changes, which really only are to disconnect sessions that are idle after 30 minutes instead of 15. But our VMRC server is enabled. The authentication set to automatic, which is important because we're in a workgroup environment at this point. But notice that we are using TCP/IP port 5900. I'm going to say OK. And we can go back in and verify that our changes have been made. Sure enough, they have. All right, now let's go back to our slides. And let's talk about getting your VMRC traffic through your firewall. Now, to get VMRC through a firewall, you'll have to open up port 5900. That's the port that VMRC uses by default. Now, if you also want to use web-based administration, you need to open up port 1024 by default. Then if you're using Kerberos authentication, because your computer is a member of the domain, you'll be using, or you need to open up ports 88, 137, and 138. If the computer has the Windows firewall enabled, it would look like this over here. You would have exceptions. If I go in here, see if we have anything from Microsoft Virtual Server. No, we do not. So to get VMRC through this firewall, we would create a port right here. I'll call it VMRC, port number TCP 5900. And there we go. Our VMRC port is allowed into this computer. We would have to, of course, turn on the firewall. But that's how it would work in the Windows firewall. You may have a Cisco PIX firewall or some other type of network firewall, and what you just need to know is TCP port 5900 needs to be opened up to allow that in. You might also have, say, a Linksys or a Netgear or a D-Link firewall on your home connection, and you want to allow VMRC in from the internet, maybe from your laptop, into your server at home. So you could open up that port on your Linksys or Netgear home network DSL cable, firewall. So that's how it would work. Basically opening up port 5900 for VMRC, and if you're using Kerberos authentication, you would then have to open up these additional ports. If you're using the web-based administration page, you'd have to open up port 1024. And again, these are all just default ports. So that's how you get VMRC through a firewall. Now let's talk about virtual server paths. Microsoft Virtual Server has, by default, a single search path. This search path looks like this: C:\documents and settings / all users / documents. Now, depending on the type of thing that you're searching for, if you're searching for VMC files, like virtual machine configuration files, it would go into the shared virtual machines subfolder. Also, if you're looking for VHD files, virtual hard drives, it would go into the same folder. Now, if you're looking for virtual networks, VNC files, it would go into the shared virtual networks subfolder that's underneath this documents folder here. So this search path can be changed and additional paths can be defined. So say that you wanted to move your shared virtual machines or your shared virtual hard drives off onto an external USB drive, you could do that. Or say you wanted to move them onto another disk array, you could do that by moving those, changing the paths for those virtual machines, and then changing your search path as well. So I'm going to show you how to change your search path, but also you can also define additional search paths. So you could have some virtual machines on one drive and other virtual machines on another drive. You could configure the search path so that way you could easily add or find additional virtual machines. So that's the benefit really of the search paths, is being able to find the virtual machines, the virtual machine configuration files, and the virtual network configuration files that you need quickly without having to enter some long path like this by hand. So with that, let me go and show you how to change the search path and also to add additional search paths. If you go into the server properties, that's where I am now, and then you go into search paths right here. Now by default, we only have the default search path here, of course, this single search path, the search path that I showed you. It says this is the default virtual machine configuration folder. Now here you can enter separate search paths. So if I had on a different drive my virtual machines, I could do something like G:\virtual machine share, like that. And then I could move virtual machines over there. I could have other virtual machines over there, add new virtual machines, clone new virtual machines over on this separate drive. And then when I go into, say, add a new virtual machine, let me show you over here. Underneath the known configuration files, when I do this drop down, it would show me those virtual machine files that are in that search path. You see up here it says this is the list of files included in the search paths or in the default configuration folder. So it says both settings are specified on the search paths page. And that's where we were. We were over on the search paths. So that's what search paths allow you to do, is to easily find these VMC files or hard drives that you're looking for. Same thing with virtual networks. If I go here to add a virtual network and I have this drop down, it shows me VNC files that it found in the search paths. So that's something that you need to keep in mind. That's where virtual server goes to look for these different files that it needs. So with that, let's go back, and we just finished talking about search paths. Now let's move on to the virtual server website. Now when you're configuring Microsoft Virtual Server through the web-based administrative interface, you're really just using Microsoft IIS. Microsoft IIS is a web server provided free from Microsoft that's included with Windows 2003 Server, and it also can be installed on Windows XP. Now, for security reasons, you may want to further secure the virtual server IIS website. By default, the website uses port 1024, but you could change the default port to make the website more difficult to find. That really doesn't increase security that much. In fact, that's called security by obscurity, by changing ports from the default to something strange that would make it hard to find. But you really can't count on that to secure your website. What you can do is you can use SSL. Secure Socket Layer would encrypt the traffic between the server and the client. Now, if you're just running this all on the same server, like I've been demonstrating here, I really don't see any need to uh, spend a lot of time on security because you're just running it all on one server. However, that server, keep in mind, is accessible over your local area network or whatever network you're connected to. So keep that in mind. Another option is to move the IIS website onto another computer. Now, to do this, what you would do is you would install Microsoft Virtual Server once on your host machine where virtual server is going to be running, and you would choose not to install the website. Then you would go to another computer that's going to be your web server. You would install Microsoft Virtual Server again, but you would choose to only install the website. So basically, you run the installation process twice, making different options each time, or different choices when you install the website. Now let's go and let's learn about changing some of the other settings we might want to change, like the auto refresh rate and the master status. Now to modify the Microsoft Virtual Server website, I scroll down here and click on the website properties underneath Virtual Server. Now one of the more annoying things, or it can be annoying, is the auto refresh. You'll be in the middle of looking maybe at the master status and all of a sudden it'll just refresh the screen. Now you might want to see what the refreshed information can provide you, but on the other hand you might also be in the middle of reading something when the screen just automatically refreshed. So in my opinion, I'd rather have this set to 0 because that would disable auto refresh. And then if I want to refresh the website, I can go up here to my Internet Explorer refresh button and just click refresh. So I'm going to change that to 0, and that way it won't automatically refresh while we're looking at something. Now something else you can do is you can customize the master status view. The master status view is over here, and it gives you an overview of everything that's going on the virtual server. What you can change is the number of virtual machines per page. Obviously, we don't have more than 10 on this computer, so that's plenty. You can take off columns such as remote view, status, runtime, CPU usage. And then there's the recent event properties. You can show what type of events you want to show and how many events you want to show. So I could change this from 5 to 10. Then on the event viewer page, you can list the number of events you want to view there. And I'm going to come back and let's see the effect on these after I apply the auto refresh here. Something else you can do is reduce the number of colors to improve performance. And then here you can change the search paths as well. So let's click on this. All right, so that brought us back to the master status page. So you see here, there's 5 events shown. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if I go to the website properties and I change this to 10 events and say OK, on master status here, it now shows us 10 events. So that's just a change you can make. You can also modify the event viewer page over here. By default, the event viewer shows 20 events. So I could change that here to only show, say, 5. There we go, just 5 events. So you see how the website properties can be modified to whatever liking you might have. Change that back to 20. All right. So that's the virtual server website properties. I just want you to be familiar with those customizations and security improvements you can make to the virtual server website. Before I move on and talk about resource allocation, we talked briefly about the virtual server website and how it uses IIS. You can make your own changes to IIS by going and modifying the IIS administrative configuration. So if I go here to Start, then I go to Programs, Administrative Tools. Here's the IIS configuration application right here. So if I open that and expand my computer, expand the websites, expand the default website, you see here this website called Virtual Server. And if you notice when you go and open the client status here, it goes to http:// the name of my computer, client1 / virtual server. So that virtual server matches up with this website over here, or this folder. I'm sorry, it's a folder, I guess, in IIS. So this folder has its own subfolders and its own files that make it work. If I right click on this and I go to Properties, here you can make configuration changes to the IIS website. Now I don't really recommend you go in here and make many changes, but if there was something you wanted to modify, say like directory security, you could do that. So that's how that works. Something else here, you can right click on this and you can do things like create a new virtual directory. You could actually explore the files that make virtual server work. Here's the VS Web app. Here's the images inside Microsoft Virtual Server. You know, again, I don't recommend you modify anything in here, but just so you know where it is and what it does and how it works, that's what's most important. Here inside Microsoft Virtual Server, you can click on the default website and you can choose to stop it and restart it. And keep in mind that if you installed some other web application, you know, you have to make sure that those don't somehow conflict. So IIS is sort of a shared resource that Microsoft Virtual Server uses, but other applications could choose to use as well. So just something to keep in mind. So if I close this out, bring us back to our slides, let's move on to our next slide, resource allocation. Now let's talk about resource allocation and performance monitoring. Resource allocation allows you to control what virtual machine has what percentage of the host computer's CPU resources. This prevents a single virtual machine from hogging the whole CPU on the host machine. So say you have a very CPU intensive application running on a virtual machine. It could theoretically hog all the CPU away from the host server and also away from the other virtual machines. So to prevent this, you use resource allocation. Resource allocation is something you configure inside the Microsoft Virtual Server web-based administrative interface. So let's go over to the web-based administrative interface for Virtual Server and see how this works. If I scroll down here, underneath the Virtual Server section, and I click on Resource Allocation, you can see here are the Client 1 CPU resource allocation settings. So right now it shows me the machines that are currently running, and I just have this one machine here. Then it shows me virtual machines not currently running, so I have these two options down here. And in this column we have relative weight. So by default the weight of each virtual machine is 100. And I talked about changing this weight to a value between 1 and 10,000. So say that I wanted this virtual machine, WinServer 2, to have twice as much CPU resources as the other virtual machines. If I put in 200 here, it would have double what another virtual machine would have if one of those other virtual machines were running. Now these resources, of course, only take effect when the utilization of your host CPU, starts to get high. So it's not like the other machine's immediately going to start running slow. It's still going to get probably just as much CPU resources as it was before until both servers start to use more and more CPU, and then Win Server 2 will get twice as much as one of the other servers that was running. Now you can also modify this reserve capacity or maximum capacity on one CPU, but really by using the weight, you're affecting um, the amount of CPU that the server is getting, and I recommend that as the option to use instead of trying to tweak these percentages over here. Now over on the right, you'll see the graph of the CPU usage. So to apply this new weight of 200 to that one server, I'll say OK. And we just modified the CPU, resource allocation. Of course, with only one server running right now, it's really getting all of the CPU that the host isn't using. So, it should have plenty. There's no reason to use wait if you only have one virtual server started. Wait would be when you have more than one virtual server started. That's when it would be useful. All right, so let's go back to our master status and then go back to our slides. So the next thing I want to talk about is performance monitoring of virtual server. And concerning performance monitoring of virtual server, you have a few different options. You have the Windows Performance Monitor and Task Manager on the host operating system. So I can go down here and I can start Task Manager. I can go into Performance and I can see the performance on my host computer. And if the performance here is getting hit hard, then maybe you're thinking, well, gee, it must be one of my virtual servers because I'm not doing anything on this, on the host computer. It must be one of those virtual machines that I have running underneath virtual server. And then in that case, you might want to go to each virtual server. But really the easiest place to start would be the master status page on the web-based administrative interface down here. So on the host machine, on the primary physical virtual server, you have Task Manager's Performance tab. It shows CPU graphs, it shows memory, it shows page file, and it also shows networking here. If I close that out, you also have the Windows Performance Monitor. So if I go to Start, I go to Programs, let's see here, in Administrative Tools, there's Performance. Here I can create charts and graphs for performance of the host computer. I can add counters. By default, it's doing pages per second of memory, average disk queue, percent of processor. I can go in here and I can add other things, say like TCP, segments per second, all sorts of different counters can be added to the Windows Performance Monitor. So here it's already graphing memory and disk queue and processor for me. So just another way of checking on the performance of your host computer. All right, now the two things I just showed you on the host computer can also be done on the guest computers or on the virtual machines themselves. So on each virtual machine, I could go into Task Manager and I could go into Windows Performance Monitor and check the performance of those individual virtual machines. How much CPU, RAM, and disk utilization are those individual virtual machines taking up? And by learning about that, maybe I want to go and tweak the CPU resource allocation. Or maybe I want to go and increase or decrease the amount of RAM that a virtual machine is getting from the host computer. So these are all things that a virtual server administrator is going to have to, periodically do, is check on the performance and tweak the performance of the virtual machines, because the virtual machines over time, some will get more usage and some will get less usage. I think that's just natural. I also talked about the master status graphs on the virtual server web interface. Let's go over here and look at that. So on the virtual server web interface here on the master status, you see this graph. It has a CPU usage graph for each virtual server that's running. So if I click on that graph, it actually takes me to the relative weights. And in the relative weights, again, here's the graph. So it shows me the CPU utilization. And if I had other servers running, each one would have its own graph. And then I'd be able to look and see, oh, well, this server's using 100% of its relative weight, and this one's using hardly anything. Maybe I want to tweak the relative weight on this one, increase this one, maybe decrease that one. You can also go, if I go to master status and then I go to edit configuration of a single virtual machine, inside the status here for the virtual machine, it shows me the average CPU utilization over the past minute. It shows me the disk I/O right here. It shows me the network I/O. So those are all things that you might want to check on when you're checking on performance. What's the network I/O and the disk I/O on this virtual machine versus the other virtual machines? To me, that's the best comparison, is compare one to the other. And the different types of applications that are running on those. And just over time, you'll learn what virtual machine needs more resources than another virtual machine. You also have to have a baseline. So when you first install these virtual machines, it's really good to take notes or do screen prints or whatever it is you need to do to know, oh, when I first installed this virtual machine, what was the average network I/O sent and received? What was the disk I/O? What was the CPU averaging? You need to write all that stuff down or have screen captures of it so you know what is normal. That way, when you look at this, you'll know that 322 bytes received of network I/O, you'll know, oh, that's a lot or that's not much at all. So that's how you check on the performance inside virtual server of the individual virtual machine. I can also go down here and go to the server properties. And inside the server properties here, I can click on physical computer properties. And here it tells me about the physical computer that this is running on. Now, in my case, this is my desktop computer, so I already know a lot about what my desktop computer has. But in other cases, if you have 10 virtual servers, you might not remember how many processors, how much RAM, what type of network adapters each of those virtual servers has. So you can go in here to the physical computer properties. You can see this computer has one physical processor, but two logical processors. So this computer is hyper-threaded, is what that means. You can see the processor speed, 3.2 gigahertz. You can see the processor type, processor features, the amount of RAM, 2 gigs, and the amount of available RAM, 1.1 gigs. You can see the different network adapters and then the operating system version. So that's a pretty helpful feature of Virtual Server to inform you of all that. The next thing that you might want to look at is the Microsoft Virtual Server Management Pack. And in one of the upcoming videos, I'm going to be talking about and hopefully demonstrating these different packages, these last three packages, as much as I can. Now, with Mom isn't something that is easy to install, so that's not something I'm really going to be able to demonstrate, but I'll be able to take you to the web page and show you what it is and where you can obtain it. But we will be demonstrating Microsoft Virtual Server Management Pack and the System Center. Both of these are available from the Microsoft website, and the Server Management Pack is an add-in that allows you to monitor performance across the different virtual servers. The System Center is similar. It has a lot of performance monitoring features. MOM is a Microsoft package that you have to purchase, very large performance monitoring package that works across all different types of Microsoft servers, not just virtual servers, but all different types of servers. And there is integration for MOM for virtual servers, so MOM can monitor Windows virtual servers. But that's not something small or inexpensive to do, is use MOM. But these other two are inexpensive or free and are easy to download and demonstrate, and we will be demonstrating those. So now let's move on and talk about the importance of events. Now, Microsoft Virtual Server events tell you what worked and what didn't. They also tell you when something is completed. The master status shows a limited number of events, but for event history, you can go to the Virtual Server event viewer. So let's go take a look at this. I know it sounds a little bit boring or maybe uninteresting looking at events, but really in Microsoft Virtual Server, that's the only way to know what really happened. When you go and you make a change, say you try to add a new virtual server or create a new virtual network or make a configuration change to the virtual server settings or the VMRC settings, you make the change and you click apply or OK, and then you're just brought back to the master status screen many times. And you don't really know if it really worked. Did it really take effect? Did it work? Or was there an error? Well, even if there's an error and it didn't work, many times in virtual server, it doesn't always tell you that. So what you have to do really every time after you make some change, you need to come back here to the master status screen or go down here to the event viewer and read the latest message or the latest few messages to see what really happened. So it says here the setting CPU wait for the virtual machine Blue Crab Food Win Server 2 was changed from 100 to 200. So you can say, oh, okay, that worked. That was a setting change and it was successful. So that way you know that your setting that you changed really did work. Because many times there'll be a big red error here that says, 200 is an invalid setting, just as an example. So you have to get in the habit of coming back here to the master status screen and looking at the recent events to see if what you changed really worked or not. The other way you can do it is you can go in here to the event viewer. And in the event viewer here, it just shows newer events and older events. And as we saw earlier, by default, it shows 20 events. So like here's a big bold error here that says the computer does not belong to the Active Directory domain. Here's another error down here. The VMRC server cannot start. So those are just examples, and you see here the icons over here. This is a red error with a X on it. This is a warning up here, and all these others are just I's, informational events that something changed. You can also filter events right here. So I can show all events. I can show virtual server events. I can show just remote control events. There's all the remote control events. I can show just events that pertain to Win Server 1. When it was started, when it was stopped. This can be pretty important if you have 10 virtual machines running on this one server. There might be so many events that it's hard to find exactly what you're looking for. Maybe you want to make sure that Win Server 1 was stopped and started at its particular backup time when the script stopped it and restarted it every night for the past week. Well, with 10 servers on here, you might not be able to find that event in the all events filter. You'll have to filter down to the particular server and find out, okay, let's see, it was started at 7:16. It was turned off. Hey, who turned it off? Maybe that's a production server. Nobody should be turning that off. So the event viewer is a very important thing to check for any system administrator, especially on a production server. But even if you're just using it for testing, just to make sure that the settings and changes that you made really were applied. All right, we talked about the importance of events, and now let's move on to our scenario. All right, in our scenario with the Blue Crab Food Company, so far we've tested creating virtual servers, virtual networks, and virtual disks. We've even been able to clone virtual servers and quickly create other servers. Now it's time to pull it all together and build your Blue Crab Food virtual network. Here's what we need. We need one Windows 2003 server that's going to be our domain controller / DNS server. We're going to configure a primary disk on there, which is going to be IDE, and then two test SCSI disks. One's going to be a fixed 1 gigabyte and 1 gigabyte dynamic disk, both SCSI. Then we're going to have a Windows 2003 file server, and then one Windows XP Pro workstation, which will be our client. Now, all three of these machines will be on their own network, their own virtual network, and Virtual Server will provide the DHCP with our own scope. You'll make one of the servers an Active Directory DC DNS server. That's going to be that first Windows 2003 server. The other server will be a member server of the domain for file sharing, and then the workstation will be our client, and it will authenticate to the Windows Active Directory. So in these first 6 videos, we learned a lot about Microsoft Virtual Server, how to install it, how to install virtual machines, how to configure virtual machines, create virtual disks, virtual networks, and clone virtual machines. So now it's time really to pull it all together and to apply this knowledge and create our own virtual network. So this type of virtual network is what I believe most users of virtual server create. They create something like this in one form or another to test Active Directory, to test applications, to test patches, security, all sorts of things. And that's really what virtual server is so great at. And so that's what I want us to create now for the Blue Crab Food Company. So with that, let's get started. All right, to do this, first I'm going to go to the web-based administrative interface. We're here at the master status. So what we said we need is 2 Windows 2003 servers and a Windows XP workstation. Well, it just so happens we already have these 2 Windows XP or Windows 2003 servers here. We have this spare Windows 2003 server. Let's go ahead and remove that. Let's get rid of that. I'm going to go here and I'm going to click on remove. We don't need that on our network. So that just removed it from the Windows Virtual Server administrative page here, but really it wasn't removed off of our computer. It's still taking up hard drive space. So to get rid of that computer, I would have to go to My Computer, Documents and Settings, All Users, Shared Documents, Shared Virtual Machines, and here's that computer right here. If we click on Properties, it's taken up 3.5 gigs of our disk space. So to get rid of it, I would just delete it right here, and it's gone. So it has to be sort of deleted in 2 places, once on virtual server and then once on your computer. The good thing about that is that if you didn't delete it on the hard drive, you could always add it back later. The bad thing is that it's still taking up space. So I think I can afford the 3.5 gigs right now. What we're going to do is close this out and go back here. All right, and the next thing we need to do is to create our Windows XP workstation. We need to create a new virtual machine. All right, to do that, we're going to go over here to Virtual Machines, and I'm going to click Create. We're going to apply this knowledge that we learned in one of the previous videos on how to create and install new virtual machines. So I'm going to call this BC for Blue Crab Win XP1. Let's give it 256 megs because it is a Windows XP workstation and it could use that RAM. As far as the hard drive space, really it only needs no more than 6 gigabytes, and we'll leave it as IDE. And it's going to be connected to a network that we already created, which is our Blue Crab Food Virtual Isolated Test Network. I'm going to click Create. All right, and we already installed Windows 2003 Server once, and we did it using an ISO image. And we're going to do the same thing here by using an ISO image. So to use an ISO image, I'm going to go to the CD properties of this computer. And currently it's attached to the physical host drive on the host machine, the D drive. But we want to use an ISO image. So to use an ISO image, I'm going to have to go to Known Image Files here. And currently there's none listed because our image files aren't in our search path. So instead I'm going to minimize this. I'm going to go to My Computer. I'm going to go find these ISO images. They're on the G drive. And I'm going to use this Windows XP Pro with Service Pack 2 120-day eval. I'm going to click on Rename there. I'm going to do Control-C to copy it. So I know it's at G:// and then here's the path .iso. So I'm going to go back here and do G://. I'm going to do Control-V, paste that in, .iso. I'll say OK. All right, and we just mounted our CD drive right here. So now when I boot up this computer, it should auto boot to this CD drive. So let's try that so we can get the installation started. So I'm turning on my Windows XP computer. I'm going to click on it to do remote control. All right, and it's going into Windows Setup. All right, so I'm going to close out these down here. We don't need these. And what I'm going to do is just let it go through the regular Windows setup. I'm going to pause the video while I answer all the questions on the normal Windows setup. And as soon as the Windows setup is completed, I'll come back and resume training here in the video. All right, we're back, and the Windows XP installation has completed. If you go down here and click on our remote control console, you can see we're at the point of login. Throughout the installation, I just took all the defaults, took the defaults for networking. For the computer name, I gave it the same name as the virtual machine, BC WinXP1. If you'll remember, we connected it to our virtual isolated network, so it doesn't have any internet access or access to my local area network. At this point, the virtual server additions are not yet installed. So as you know, I have that problem where my mouse is not synchronized between the two. So if I click on the screen here, we can log on with the administrator password. We should have gotten an IP address from our virtual server DHCP server. And we can verify that as soon as we get logged on. It's our first time logging on, so it seems like it's taking a little bit longer than normal. Once we get logged on, we can verify that we should be able to communicate with the other Windows 2003 server that's over in the same isolated network, our other virtual server that we've been working with throughout the video series. So to get out of this, my mouse is locked in here. To get out of this so I can scroll down and hopefully see the start button, I press the right Alt key and I can scroll down a little bit. Here we go. So as soon as that start button comes up, we'll run the command prompt and we'll check our IP address settings. Now this computer, we allocated 256 megabytes of RAM to this computer. So, you know, the more RAM, the better with Windows XP. All right, the first thing I notice here, all these pop-ups. First thing I notice is our local area connection says it has limited or no connectivity. So let's double click on that, go to support, go to details, and it says here we got a automatic private IP address. We should have got an IP address from our virtual server DHCP server. So let's go find out why that did not happen. I close this out. I'm going to press right Alt to get out. I'm going to scroll down and let's go to the master status. Let's go configure the Blue Crab Food Virtual Isolated Test Network. All right, if you look here on DHCP, it does say DHCP server is enabled, and that's the Blue Crab Food Virtual Isolated Test Network. Physical network adapter, we have none, so it's a true virtual, complete virtual network. If we go in here to network settings, everything looks good there. So let's go configure our Blue Crab Food Windows XP1 server, and let's double check the network that it belongs to. Network adapters says it's connected to the virtual isolated test network. So that looks good. Says it cannot be added or removed because the virtual machine is running. All right, that's fine. So if we go back to master status, then let's go back to the remote control of our Windows XP workstation. So if I open up the network information here, I go to support, Let's do a repair on this. See if we can fix our DHCP problem. At this point, it should be requesting an IP address, and that virtual server, DHCP server, on our isolated test network should respond and give it an IP address. Seems like it's taking a little too long there. Let's go over to our other virtual server that's on the same network, WinServer 2. It's on the same test network, so that looks good. Let's check our events, see if any events have happened. No events since the virtual machine was started that has to do with DHCP. Let's check this virtual isolated test network. All right, network address 10.241.0.0. Subnet mask starting IP, so the first one would be 16. Ending IP goes up a long way. Virtual DHCP server's IP address, default gateway, and DNS servers. Everything looks good there. Let's go ahead, let's uncheck this enabled, and let's turn off this DHCP server. Let's go back in and turn back on this DHCP server. Let's see if that makes a difference. All right, so it failed last time, but we stopped and started the DHCP server, so let's do a repair again. We got a different response that time, invalid IP address. Let's repair one more time. While that's happening, let's go over to our Windows 2003 server, and let's do a repair over there. An IP address conflict. So welcome to one of those real-world problems that can happen when you start and stop multiple virtual servers and you have DHCP servers, that are going up and down. So apparently there's an IP address conflict between these two machines because these are the only two machines running on the network. So I'm going to say OK here. Let's log into this virtual machine and I'll show you how to fix this problem. Let's do a release on this computer. And let's go back to master status. Let's do remote control on the Windows XP workstation. I'm going to go to a command prompt. I'm going to do an ipconfig release here as well. Okay, neither one of these computers have IP addresses. Now we're going to go back to our master status. I'm going to go and configure this isolated test network. Going to go to the DHCP server, going to disable it. Now let's go back in and we'll re-enable it. Okay, then we'll go to remote control. Then we'll do a renew on our new workstation. There we go. We got an IP address from our DHCP server. Now, just to prove that we can really do two at once, or we can really have more than one computer getting an IP address from that DHCP server, let's go do remote control on the 2003 workstation, or 2003 server, excuse me. And if I go up here and do an IP config renew on this one, there we go. We got an IP address. So both of these are on the same network, this isolated test network. I'm going to ping between these, verify that they can communicate. Boy, they're not having much luck communicating today, are they? Let's go back to the XP workstation. Let's do a ping over here to the 17, the .17 address. There we go. We can ping. All right, we can ping back to the Windows 2003 server. So let's go back to that 2003 server. I'm going to say remember my password for convenience here. And we cannot ping the Windows XP workstation. So why is that? Well, another option is this is Windows Service Pack 2. So let's go check the firewall on that Windows XP workstation. Remember, these are real machines. And with Service Pack 2, you get a firewall installed by default. Change your Windows firewall settings, and it's on. So let's turn it off. Oops. Okay, it says no firewall is turned on. Our computer might be at risk. Let's go back in. Verify. Sure enough, it is turned off. All right. Go back here. Verify we can ping the Windows 2003 server. So exit out of here. Let's go over to the 2003 server. And there we go. We get a reply. So you got to watch out for little things like that. It's not always virtual server that's causing the problem. It could be a firewall in this case. It could be an IP address conflict. You know, these are regular machines, and you're going to have regular problems like this to deal with. Virtual server doesn't fix all the eccentricities that you have to deal with, and troubleshooting issues you might have to deal with along with Windows servers. So at this point, we have two computers on our isolated test network. We have a Windows 2003 server, and we have a Windows XP workstation. Next, we need to get our third machine on this network, which is going to be our other Windows 2003 server. So currently, the Windows 2003 server and the XP workstation are both using DHCP for the third machine I'm going to bring on, I want that to be the domain controller, the DNS server. So I'm not going to configure DHCP on it. I need to configure a static IP address on that computer. So let's go over and go to our master status, and let's go ahead and turn on this Blue Crab Food Win Server 1. This is going to be our Active Directory domain controller and DNS server. So I'm going to, well, tell you what, before I turn that on, let's double check our RAM. You know, the more workstations we start here, the more RAM we're using. So this Windows XP workstation, I know it's using 256. The Win Server 2, let's see what it's using. It's got 384 configured. So if I open my calculator here, I've got 2 gigs minus 384 minus 256. I should be able to spare, you know, another 300 megabytes of RAM and still leave a gig for my host computer. So let's go to this Win Server 1. If I scroll down, here's the RAM. It's configured for 384, so that should be fine. You just want to make sure you don't, you know, overutilize your host computer, and then your mouse starts to get really slow, and it's really hard to change back and forth between windows. So now we can go ahead and start this computer up. Well, one more thing I just thought of before we start that up. Let's make sure it's on the right network. Right now it's connected to this wireless network. So we need to go in here and change our network adapters and connect this to the virtual isolated test network. Okay, now it's connected to a different network. So now we can go ahead and turn it on. All right, it'll take just a second to start up. While it's starting up, I'm going to go ahead and pause the video, and I'll come back as soon as the workstation started up. All right, we're back, and our Blue Crab Food Win Server 1 has completed booting up. If I go in here and I do remote control, let's get logged in. Press the right Alt and the delete button at the same time is how you log in. So I'm going to go to a command prompt, and let's do an ipconfig/all on this computer. All right, so it did receive an IP address the first time by DHCP, 10.241.0.18. So now I should be able to ping both of these other machines. There we go. So all three of these machines are on the same virtual isolated test network. Now what I want to do is, because this server number 1 is going to be our Active Directory domain controller and our DNS server, it needs to have a static IP. It can't have a dynamic IP address. So to do that, let's go and look at the DHCP scope that we have created to make sure the IP address we're going to assign isn't in that scope, but it's still on the same network. So if I go into the DHCP settings here, oh, I went into the wrong adapter, I'm sorry. Here we go, Blue Crab Food Network. All right, so notice the network is 10.241. See, I'm going to get out a pin here and write down the IP address I'm going to assign. It's got to be 10.241 dot something dot something. The starting IP address for the DHCP range is .16, and it goes all the way up here. So if I were to assign, let's see, I can't assign 10.241.0.1 because that's our DHCP server, but I could assign 10.241.0.2. So I'm going to write that down. That's going to be our DNS server. And so down here in the DNS servers, I need to modify that. 10.241.0.2, that's going to be our new DNS server. If I scroll down, I'm going to say OK and apply that. And then what we're going to do is, once we get DNS configured on that server, we'll go back to the other two clients and we'll do a release and a renew so that they get that DNS server's IP address via DHCP. So now let's go back here and let's do remote control again on server 1. All right, I'm going to do an IP config release. We'll give up that IP address. Okay, now what I'll do is open my network adapter. Going to go into properties. Going to click on properties for TCP IP and statically assign an IP address, but one that's in the right range. We don't have a default gateway because this is an isolated network. The DNS server is going to be this server itself. Say OK there. Close this out. We're going to do an IP config/all. Verify we have that IP address. And now let's ping our other hosts. And we still can communicate. All right, that looks good. Okay, next I want to verify the names on these computers. So this is bcrab Win Server or Win 2003-1, and it's in a work group. Our next server here is bcrab Win Server or Win 2003-2, and it's in a work group. Then I already know the other Windows XP workstation is BC Win XP-1, and it's in the same work group. So we verified all the names. We verified we can communicate. Verified they're all in a work group. Both of the Windows 2003 servers have the virtual server editions. The one that doesn't have it yet is the Windows XP workstation. So let's go ahead, let's use the virtual machine remote control client. I think it would be more convenient. And what you can do here is you got this drop down where you can type in the names of the servers you want to connect to. So in our case, we want to connect to BC Win XP-1. All right, I'm going to exit out of this. Okay. And let's get rid of the clock here just so we don't have to watch the time. Click buy. And the next thing we want to do is install the virtual server additions. So to do that, well, see my mouse is locked in here. I'm going to go back to the master status. I'm going to do configure or edit configuration on our Windows XP workstation. Right here it says VMware additions, I'm sorry, virtual server additions. And what we're going to do here is check this checkbox. And that's going to install the virtual machine additions. So I'm going to say OK. And it says if the guest operating system is configured to autoplay CDs, setup will start automatically. I'm going to say OK. And let's go back and see if something happens. Yes, it does. So what's happening now is it mounted the ISO file for the virtual server additions. It has autoplay on there, so just like if you put a CD in the drive, it automatically plays that CD and it starts the installation. So I'm going to say next. Take just a second here to install the additions. And setup is complete. We'll click Finish. And it says you must restart this computer. So I'll say yes, we will restart the computer. And it'll automatically reboot. So at this point, with my 2 gigabytes of RAM I've got in this computer, I've got 3 virtual machines running. I've got 2 Windows 2003 servers that are using 384 megabytes of RAM, and I have a Windows XP workstation using 256 megabytes of RAM. And I haven't really seen any adverse performance so far. While this is booting, we can go down and I can click on my task manager and monitor the performance of the host operating system. So you can see I'm hitting my single CPU there fairly hard at some points, and then it goes back down to 17% or 19%. So that's pretty amazing considering I've got 2 servers and a workstation all running, plus the host operating system. So it's like 4 operating systems on this one computer, and here my CPU is sitting here at 4% CPU usage. My RAM though, because it's allocated all the time, as soon as you start that virtual machine, that RAM is allocated. You can see my 2 gigs of RAM here. I have 756 megabytes free. So my RAM's getting hit pretty hard. If I go over to networking, there's next to nothing there. If I go to processes and I sort by memory usage, and you have to say show processes for all users, not just me. Well, it doesn't show you the total RAM in use. It's really not showing you all the services. Let's see, even if we refresh here, no luck. Might be able to add some columns to actually get the usage for those virtual machines, but it doesn't look like it's available in just the regular Windows Task Manager. But you can see over here the performance, the amount of RAM that's being utilized, 1.5 gig used in the page file, and 751 megabytes free out of the physical RAM. So pretty amazing, and it's great to monitor your host operating system, just like you really need to monitor your guest operating systems as well. So it looks like our workstation has booted. I'm going to log in, and you know what? I can tell immediately, just right when I clicked on that, I can move my mouse back and forth, so those virtual server additions are working. So that was the next thing on my checklist, was the virtual server additions. So we can cross that off. The next thing we want to do is we want to really make these computers work in Windows Active Directory. And I know that's not part of virtual server, but I think it's a realistic thing that people do. And it's something you would do if you had really 3 separate computers all plugged into a switch. It's the same thing you're going to do inside virtual server. So I'm going to go over to the Windows 2003 server number 1, and I'm going to add Active Directory and DNS on that server. So right here, using the virtual machine remote console, I can do the drop down, and I can just connect to that server that fast. So to do this, I'm going to do run, and I'm going to type DC promo. This is the Active Directory installation wizard. This is a domain controller and a new domain in a new forest. Full DNS name, bluecrabfood.com. And I know I'm kind of going through this quick. Just taking all the defaults. I do need to install and configure DNS on this server. And it's installing Windows Active Directory and DNS. A pretty cool task to be performing on my Windows XP, desktop computer. So I get experience doing this, plus I'm building my Active Directory test network. Soon we're going to have that Windows XP workstation logging into this bluecrabfood.com domain. So this will take just a second. In fact, it's running pretty fast considering I only have 384 megabytes of RAM on this new domain controller. So I don't know exactly how long this is going to take. What I'm going to do is I'm going to minimize that. I'm going to pause the recording, and I'll be right back as soon as it completes. Okay, we're back, but the Active Directory installation is not yet complete. Let me show you what it's telling us. It's saying to us that some files from Service Pack 1 CD-ROM are needed. So what we need to do is insert the CD-ROM for Windows 2003 Service Pack 1. It needs that to complete the installation. So let's see what CDs are in this computer right now. If I go to my computer, there's a couple CDs mounted. Let's go over and see what they are on the virtual server administrative interface. So if I scroll down here, I'm on the Blue Crab Food Win Server 1 status. If I scroll down to CDs, I can see that on the primary channel 1, Office 2003 Pro is mounted, and on the secondary channel, host drive D is mounted on the secondary channel 0. Now, don't always just assume that this is drive D and this is drive E. These drives might be reversed over on the host. So you have to be careful with that. If I go back here to the host, in fact, drive E, it says is Office. Drive D is this CD here. So drive D does match, I'm sorry, drive D matches up with this drive D down here. Drive E matches up with this Office right here. So these are in reverse order. This is the drive E, this is the drive D on the guest computer. So make sure that you don't just assume that it's D then E. So what we want to do is we want to replace the, let's see, we want to put it in drive D it's asking for here. Of course, we could change this to whatever letter we want, but that's where we want to put it. So to put it in drive D, I'm going to have to modify the second entry right here, this DVD drive 2. So to do that, I'm going to scroll down here, and oh, let me point this out at the top here. It says CD DVD drives cannot be added, moved, or removed because the virtual machine is running or saved, but you can still capture media. So what that means is you cannot remove a DVD drive, nor can you add a new one, but you can change this capture down here. So you can say it has no media, you can point it to a physical drive, or you can change it to an image file. So to do that, I'm going to change this down here to a known image file. And to get the path to the CD-ROM for Service Pack 1 Windows 2003, I'm going to go to My Computer, then go to this G drive where I have my ISO image files. And right here is Windows 2003 Server with Service Pack 1 included. I'm going to right-click and rename that. I'm going to do a Control-C, then go back here. And here I'm going to type in G:\/ because that's the name of the drive. I'm going to paste in that path and then put in .iso. Okay, I just applied that. Let's go back here. And it pops up with Windows 2003 Server. That's a good sign. I'm going to close that out. Go here to the Active Directory installation. And it automatically recognized that I'd inserted the CD. All right, now that's while that's configuring the rest of DNS, let me go back here and show you something else. One of the things I've learned in troubleshooting CD drives on virtual server is that if I go here and say that I just change this path right here to a different file name, say I change it from Pro Enterprise to Pro Standard, and then I click OK. Well, back on the virtual server over here, it might think that the original CD is still in the drive, and it won't recognize the new CD. In fact, it just keeps thinking that the old CD is still in the drive, and in fact, it even acts like the old CD is in the drive if you can go to the drive and you can browse the files on the CD. So to get rid of this, what I found as a troubleshooting step is you say no media. You say that this has no media. You go down here and you say OK, and then you apply it. And then you come back and then you change it back to the ISO image file that you want to put or apply to that drive. Then you say OK. So it's just sort of an extra step that you have to do to get it to recognize different ISO files. You have to come in and say it doesn't have any media. then you have to come back and say, okay, it does have media, and here's the ISO image that's on that drive. So something to keep under your hat in case you need that little troubleshooting trick there. So let's go to the master status, and then I'm going to minimize this, and we'll go back here to the Active Directory installation wizard. And sure enough, it says the Active Directory installation wizard has completed installing Active Directory for the bluecrabfood.com domain. I'm going to say finish, and it says I have to restart the computer. So while the server's booting up, again, I'm going to pause the video, and I'll be right back. Okay, we're back, and the Windows 2003 server has booted back up. I'm going to log on. Just make sure we can log on there. And then something else I'm going to go do is go and start up the VMRC for our Windows XP computer. So I know I already have the VMRC running to the Windows 2003 server. Another thing you can do here is you can start a second or a third or a fourth VMRC. So I'm going to connect to the Blue Crab Windows XP 1 computer. And here we go. I've got both computers up and running at the same time. Obviously, the resolution on this one is a little off. Well, we can come back to that later. For now, what I want to do is just join the new Windows XP computer to the new Active Directory domain. So to do that, I'm going to go to Start. I'm going to right-click on my computer and go to Properties. I'm going to go to Computer Name. And we have a proper name, but we want to join the domain. We want to move from a work group to a domain. So I'm going to change that here. I'm going to put in domain, and it'll be the bluecrabfood.com domain. I'll say OK. I have to type in the domain administrator's username password. And it says, welcome to the bluecrabfood.com domain. You must restart this computer. We'll say OK. And OK. All right, now our computer's rebooting. Let's go over here, and while that's rebooting, let's troubleshoot this a little bit. If I go up here to remote control, one thing I can do is switch to full screen, so I can hold down the host key and press enter. Let's try that. Okay, we're going to change the resolution here from 800 or from 640 by 480 to 800 by 600. And then I'm going to say, no, I don't want to keep those settings, and go back. Let's verify that this is 640 by 480, and it is. Now let's exit the full screen mode. Okay, and that fixed our problem right there. So I just had to kind of go into full screen and then back out of full screen, and that resolved our issue. And then our Windows XP workstation has rebooted. I'm going to click here and log on. Oh, and before I log on, take a look at this. Now I can either log on to the local computer, or I can log on to the domain. So let's go ahead and log on to the domain. All right, that was successful. Joining the XP domain and logging on to the domain. So I logged on as domain administrator. But as you know, you shouldn't really log on to a workstation as a domain administrator, right? You should really log on as a regular user if at all possible. The principle of least privilege, right? So to set up a regular user, I'm going to go to Start, Administrative Tools, Active Directory Users and Computers. And if you're not at all familiar with Windows domains and Active Directory users and computers, I highly recommend the train signals videos, train signal videos that cover Active Directory users and computers and domains. They have a great series of videos that cover this one topic. So let's go in here and let's just add a new user. And I'm just going to add myself. It doesn't meet the password complexity requirements. All right. There we go. We added a new user. So now I'm going to go over here to our uh, VMRC, and as you can see, the resolution is kind of, messed up again. Whoops, I accidentally clicked on that. Sorry about that. So to fix this, I'm going to go into full screen mode and then back out again. And that fixed our resolution issue. All right, let's go over here and let's log off of our XP workstation. And I'm going to log on again with right alt delete. And it looks like the screen's a little messed up. Let me refresh that. There we go. This time I'm going to log on as myself with our new Active Directory user account. And let's go ahead and do remote control to WinServer 2. So I've got both going here. Successfully logged in as D Davis, the new user that we created. I can minimize that. So now let's make our other Windows 2003 server a member of the domain. It says the domain controller could not be contacted. Ensure that the domain name is typed correctly. Well, the domain name does look correct. See some more details here. And no DNS servers. So why don't we have a DNS server? Let's take a look at that. Sure enough, we do not have a DNS server. Well, why is that? That's because this computer is getting DHCP from the Microsoft Virtual Server DHCP server on our isolated network. And what we did is we put in the DNS server after this computer already got its IP address. So for us to get a DNS server IP address so that we can join the domain, I'm going to have to do an IP config release and an IP config renew. There we go. We have a DNS server now. See that 10.241.0.2. So now we should be able to join the domain. And again, I know I'm going fast, but this isn't really meant to be a class in or a video in Active Directory, but just to show you all the different things you can do with Virtual Server, and just to demonstrate how we can create a virtual isolated network with 3 real working functional servers that are all part of an Active Directory domain with DNS and all the computers and member servers a member of the domain using the virtual server DHCP server, and how it can all be on an isolated network and work together all on a single workstation. All right, so here's our member server. It's our member server. We're going to reboot it. We're going to reboot it so that it'll then be a member of the domain. And let's go back to our Windows XP workstation. And let's verify that it has a DNS server IP address. Sure enough, it does. If it didn't, it wouldn't have been able to join the domain. So if I go to my computer, then I go to my network places, look at the entire network, the Microsoft Windows network. I see here the Blue Crab Food Network, and I see the bcrab Win 2003 server, and then I see this workstation. And soon we should be able to see the bcrab Win 2003 server number 2. So I'm going to close that out, and let's go back here to our server number 2. It's connecting to the network, applying computer settings. What we're going to do is we're going to make a file share, and then we're going to make sure we can access that from our Windows XP workstation. All right, if you'll remember, we did set up some virtual disks out here. So this is a 100 megabyte virtual disk. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share it on the network. Going to create a new share and call this shared 100 megabyte. Set up the permissions. So that the D Davis user, here we go, we're going to remove everyone. We're going to set up D Davis to have full control to this shared folder. And I'm going to have to go to full screen so I can press the OK button there. That's because of the resolution. All right, now that's a shared folder. Okay, before we move on and try to access this share from our Windows XP client, there's one more thing we need to think about. We said that this Windows 2003 server has Service Pack 1. Service Pack 1 for Windows 2003 includes a firewall that's automatically enabled. So because this is going to be a file share, we're going to have to either disable that firewall or have an exception created in the firewall. So we're just going to disable it for simplicity's sake. So let's go to our local area connection, properties, advanced, settings, turn off that firewall. And I'm going to go to full screen just so I can see this a little bit better. Actually, I can't. There we go. That should be okay. Let's go back in and make sure it's really off. Yes, it is. And we'll exit full screen. And let's minimize that. Now let's go over to our Windows XP workstation. I'm going to go into full screen mode. I'm going to go to my computer. I'm going to go to my network places. Go to the entire network, Microsoft Windows network, the Blue Crab Food domain, and bcrab Win 2003 server 2. And there's our shared file right there. There's that file we put over on that shared virtual disk that we created, that 100 megabyte virtual disk. That's that 12 megabyte file we put over there. So we should be able to copy that and paste it. Oh, access is denied. Well, that's NTFS permissions. But we won't get into that. So many complexities to setting up a Windows network. But the point of this is not to bore you and go into every possible Windows troubleshooting scenario, but just to show you that virtual server makes a great environment to set up 2, 3, 4, or more servers all working together so that you can test out some Windows patch, some application upgrade, or networking change, whatever it is you want to test out. So let's go back to our slides and see if there's anything we missed. We set up our Windows 2003 server. It's a DC DNS. We did not do the disk right here. That's the last thing I believe we need to do. We did create our file server. We have our client. The virtual server software is providing DHCP with its own scope. One of the servers is a domain controller. The other server is a member server with file sharing. The workstation is our client, and it's authenticating to the Windows Active Directory. So the last thing we said that we needed to do for the Blue Crab Foods scenario is to create two test SCSI disks, one fixed and one dynamic. So to do this, I'm going to minimize the slides. We can get rid of our Windows XP workstation. We said we were going to do this on server number 1. I'm going to close this out. So to actually create the disk, I'm going to go back to our web-based administrative interface. I'm going to go to Create, One Dynamic Expanding Virtual Disk. For location, I'm going to put it underneath Win Server 1. I'm going to make it 1 gigabyte. And this is going to be a dynamic. So the first one's a dynamic. Oh, what did I forget right there? I forgot the name. Get going too fast and forget to type in the name right here. I'm going to call this dyne.scsi 1.vhd. We'll make it 1 gigabyte. Let's do a refresh here. All right, it says right here the virtual hard disk dyne.scsi 1.vhd was created. Just remember to check your events to see if it really worked or if it failed. So now let's create a fixed disk. And by the way, did you notice how fast that dynamic disk was created? Really fast for a 1 gigabyte disk. Now let's call this fixed SCSI 2.vhd. I'm going to make it 1 gigabyte and say create. You notice here it says creating a new virtual hard disk. So this might take a little bit longer. And why is that? Well, because this is a fixed disk. So it's actually carving out 1 gigabyte of disk space out of my host computer's hard drive for this disk right here. And you can see how long it's taking because it's actually creating that 1 gigabyte file. That's the difference between a fixed and a dynamic hard drive. Dynamic hard drive, it just made a little probably 40 kilobyte pointer, and it's going to grow as I add files to it. The fixed hard drive, it's creating the full 1 gigabyte file when I told it to create it, and it's taking that disk space right now. Each one of those has its own benefit. All right, the fixed hard drive was created. So now what we need to do is we need to add these hard drives to our server. So this is Win Server 1. Because we're going to add hard drives to it, we need to shut it down. So I'm going to go here, I'm going to shut down Win Server 1. The comment I'm going to make is to add SCSI hard drives. Okay, so let's go into edit the configuration. Still says it's running. We'll give it a second. It is a domain controller now, so I suppose it has a little bit more to do than it did before. We also could be suffering a little bit of performance decrease because I've got a single processor, 3 gigahertz system running 3 different machines all at the same time. Obviously, things are still working fine. Just all of a sudden, things are, taking just a little bit longer than they did before. It's still very usable and it works fine. All right, so let's make sure it's off. It's got to be off to add new disk drives. I'm going to go into hard disks. And what we need to do is to add a disk. Where are we going to attach it? We don't want to attach it to one of these channels. So what we're doing here is we're adding it to the wrong place. We need to add two disks. And as you notice here, there's only one channel left. So these are SCSI disks that we want to add, but these channels here, obviously these are IDE channels that we're trying to add it to. So we're in the wrong place to add these virtual disks. Let's go back and look at the configuration for this virtual server. So I was going into hard disk here, right? What I need to do is go into SCSI adapters because these are SCSI disks. So first I need to add a SCSI adapter, virtual SCSI adapter. I'm going to say OK. Now I can scroll down and I have a virtual SCSI adapter. If I go in here, so this is what I had to do first. First I had to add a SCSI adapter. Next I can go into hard drives and I can add a disk. Now I have more choices. See, I have these SCSI options that I didn't have before because now I have a SCSI adapter. So I'm going to say SCSI ID 1. I have a known SCSI disk. I'm going to add the dynamic disk. Say OK. So I have that SCSI disk. I'm going to go in here to hard disk again. And of course, I could have added them right at the same time. Going to add another disk. We're going to put this on SCSI ID 2. And this is going to be the fixed disk. I'll say OK. So we just added two more SCSI disks, both 1 gigabyte, one fixed, one dynamic, and we added a SCSI adapter. So now let's turn on this virtual machine. You can see here it's running, and it's just barely going to start up the Windows boot process in just a second. So just to save you some time on watching this computer boot up, I'm going to minimize that. I'm going to pause the video recording right now, and I'm going to come back as soon as it's booted up. All right, our virtual server has booted back up, and I'm going to log on. Now this is our domain controller that we just added two SCSI disks to. Okay, if I go into Start and I go to My Computer, notice I don't have new SCSI disk here yet. Let's see if we can get this working. If I right-click on my computer and go to Properties, I'm going to go into Hardware. I'm going to go into Device Manager. Okay, notice here that now I have an Adaptec SCSI controller. That's good news. Now over in IDE, I still just have, my primary and secondary IDE channels because those new hard drives I added are on the SCSI channel over here. So let's, one more thing, let's check disk drives. Notice I do have two Microsoft Virtual SCSI disk drives, and then I have a virtual hard drive. So this virtual hard drive, this is my IDE primary boot drive. These two SCSI disks, these are the two new SCSI disks I added. But now they're not showing up in my computer yet because they haven't been initialized and formatted. So to do that, I'm going to go to Start, Administrative Tools, Computer Management. I'm going to go to Disk Management. And it says, welcome to the disk initialization wizard. I have two more disks to initialize. I'll say next. Do I want to convert them? Sure, let's convert them to dynamic disk. So it's going to initialize the master boot record on both of these disks and convert both disks. So now I have my basic disk, which is my boot drive, my IDE disk. It's 6 gigabytes. Here I have a dynamic disk that's 1 gigabyte. This is one of my SCSI drives. Here I have another dynamic disk, which is my other 1 gigabyte SCSI drive. Now, don't confuse virtual server dynamically expanding disk with Windows dynamic disk. Two completely different things. So one of these disk drives is my fixed, and one of these disk drives is my dynamically expanding virtual disk. But inside Windows, I told it to configure them both as Windows dynamic disk. Those are again, those are different from Microsoft Virtual Server dynamically expanding virtual disk. So now I need to right click on this, and I'm going to do a new volume. We'll just make it a simple volume. I'm going to call it drive F. We're going to format it and call it SCSI1. Going to perform a quick format. There we go. It's formatting and healthy. Well, it should be healthy in just a second. And I could have done a mirrored pair on these even. You know, I could use RAID. I could use RAID 1 on these. I could do a lot of different things with my two brand new SCSI disks. And isn't that funny? I don't even have a SCSI disk here in my office, you know, but according to this Windows 2003 server, I have two SCSI disks that I could configure RAID 1 mirroring on. So there's a lot of flexibility with this Microsoft Virtual Server. There we go, formatting. And in a minute it should be healthy as well. Brand new SCSI disk F and G. So I can close this out, go to Start, go to My Computer, and here we go. SCSI 1 and SCSI 2. Disk F and G, they're 1 gigabyte each. And if we go in here, we can put some files on them. Let's see, let's copy just this media directory over there. Is there even anything in there? Yep, there's some WAV files. Let's copy it here as well. Okay, let's go look quickly over on My Computer, on my C drive, Documents and Settings, All Users. This is over on the host computer. That's where I am on the host. Shared Documents, Shared Virtual Machines, Blue Crab Food Win Server 1, and here I have my two brand new SCSI disk, SCSI Disk 1 and SCSI Disk 2. Now, they could be reversed. I don't know. I'm not saying that this SCSI Disk 1 is the same SCSI Disk 1 on the other side, or this SCSI Disk 2 is the same SCSI Disk 2 over on the guest operating system. You would have to do a little verification to find out which is which. But the point I want to make here is here's my fixed, and notice how it's 1 gigabyte, and here's my dynamic, and notice how it's 20 gigabytes. Before I copied in that media folder, it certainly, or I'm sorry, it's 20 megabytes. It certainly wasn't 20 megabytes. It was just a handful of K. So that's my two brand new SCSI disks that I can do mirroring and RAID on, or whatever it is I want to do. Over here in my virtual server, they're shown here, SCSI disk 1 and 2, and they're a gigabyte each. And we put some files on them. So let's minimize that, and let's go back to our scenario. So we just completed this part of the Blue Crab Food test scenario. And with that, that means that we completed the entire scenario. I know it took a little while, but I really wanted to show you what it looked like to kind of pull it all together with Microsoft Virtual Server, to have two different servers running along with a workstation, have an Active Directory domain controller, DNS, use DHCP from the Microsoft Virtual Server, have the Active Directory computer join the domain, and see what kind of problems you run into when you start mounting CD-ROM drives, creating disk drives, creating SCSI disk drives, sharing, folders, all these different things you can do with Microsoft Virtual Server. It's very powerful tool. So that ends our piece of the scenario, and we can move on to our conclusion. So in conclusion, in this video, we learned about Microsoft Virtual Server security, how you can configure administrators or Windows groups to just be able to control the entire virtual server, or if you want to really get granular, you can go into NTFS security and configure the files and folders so that individual users or groups of users can control the individual virtual machines. You can also configure virtual machines to start as a certain user instead of, say, the administrator account. We learned about the VMRC configuration, how you can change the port number, and how you can tunnel VMRC through a firewall. It uses port 5900, as you know, but you can change that. The web-based administrative interface uses port 1024, and if you make your virtual server a member of the Active Directory domain, you can use Kerberos security, in which case you have to open up the Kerberos ports if you're running Kerberos through a firewall. We learned about the importance of virtual server paths, how they just make it more convenient for you to quickly find virtual hard drives, virtual networks, and CD-ROM drives when you go to add those to your virtual server. We learned about the virtual server website properties and how you can customize that. We learned about resource allocation, how you can allocate CPU resources to different servers using weights. So you give one higher weight to one server and a lower weight to the other server, so that one server gets more CPU resources from the host computer than the other guest computers do. We learned about performance monitoring, different ways to do that inside the host operating system or inside the guest operating system. And a little bit later in the series, we're going to talk about some other performance monitoring tools. We learned about the importance of events and how virtual server many times doesn't tell you if something went wrong. It's really up to you to go to the event log and check to see if what you did actually succeeded or failed. And then finally, in our scenario, we brought it all together with two Windows 2003 servers and a Windows XP workstation, all running at the same time, all being viewed by VMRC consoles on the same screen at the same time, and how you can configure all those to talk together on their own virtual private network. So with that, that concludes the end of video number 6. Thank you very much.